Years of mockery and exclusion from her controlling family pushed this overlooked daughter to build her own fortune in secret. When her father passes and leaves the estate to her scheming siblings, she drops the bombshell evidence of his fraud, reversing the inheritance, exposing decades of lies, and watching the greedy family fall apart in stunned disbelief. If you enjoy the log line, support us by subscribing and sharing our videos. Now let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Funeral Insult. If you think funerals are about grief, you've never stood beside a coffin while your own family buries you with it. Before we begin, ask yourself this: what would you do if the people meant to mourn with you used the moment to remind you that you were nothing? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, nothing will look the same. The church smelled of lilies and polished wood. Soft organ music drifted across rows of black fabric and expensive perfume. At the front lay my father, Robert Whitmore, encased in mahogany and legacy. Business partners filled the first pews. Politicians stood near the aisle. Cameras lingered discreetly at the back. Appearances mattered. They always had. I stood to the left of the casket, dressed in simple black silk. No diamonds. No dramatic veil. Just stillness. Daniel stood to the right. Golden sun. Tailored suit. Perfect posture. The heir everyone expected. He stepped forward when the pastor invited family to speak. My father built an empire from nothing, Daniel began, voice thick with rehearsed grief. He believed in strength. In results. In building something that lasts. Nods. Murmurs of approval. Then he glanced at me. And he believed some people just aren't built for that. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the front rows. Camille lowered her head as if embarrassed for me. We all have different talents, she added sweetly when she took her turn. Some of us lead. Some of us try. Try. The word slid across the room like a blade wrapped in velvet. Behind me, a cousin whispered, she never had the head for business anyway. Another voice, poor thing. At least she'll be taken care of. Taken care of. I felt every eye press against my back, waiting for tears. For humiliation. For confirmation that I was exactly what they believed. Instead, I folded my hands over the small leather folder tucked against my waist. No one noticed it. They were too busy burying the wrong daughter. I stepped forward only once, placing a single white rose on the casket. I did not speak. I did not defend myself. Because grief is loud. But preparation is silent. As the final hymn echoed and guests began filing out, Daniel leaned close enough for only me to hear. Tomorrow might be hard for you, he murmured. Try not to be disappointed. I met his eyes. I won't be, I said softly. That night, rain traced quiet lines down my apartment windows while I placed the leather folder on my kitchen table and opened it. Inside were copies. Signed documents. Transfer records. A trust agreement dated 13 years ago. $2 million. Protected. Untouchable. And one clause that would change everything. The next morning, we gathered at Sterling and Howe for the will reading. The room was polished oak and old money confidence. Daniel looked relaxed. Camille looked victorious. I looked patient. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Cleared his throat. And then, he hesitated. His eyes flicked back to the final page. Silence thickened. I was not aware of this addendum, he said slowly. And for the first time since the funeral began. My brother stopped smiling. Chapter 2. The Scapegoat Child. The silence in the conference room stretched thin, like glass about to crack. Daniel's fingers tightened on the armrest. What addendum? He asked, too casually. The lawyer adjusted his glasses again. It appears to reference a protected trust and historical asset disclosures. Camille turned to me slowly. You knew about this. I held her gaze. I know a lot of things. But I didn't learn them in that room. I learned them years ago when I first understood I was never meant to inherit anything except dismissal. I was 9 the first time my father introduced Daniel as my successor. We were at a charity gala. crystal chandeliers, flashing cameras, Camille in a silk dress the color of champagne, Daniel shaking hands like a small executive. And this is my youngest, father added when someone noticed me beside him. She's creative. Creative. The polite word for irrelevant. At home, it was less refined. Daniel sat inside father's office absorbing business terminology like oxygen. Camille learned social strategy at luncheons and fundraisers. I learned silence. Close the door, father would say if I hovered too long. This isn't for you. At dinner, they discussed mergers and expansions. I once asked what a holding company was. Daniel laughed outright. It's not a book club. Camille smirked. She still thinks saving allowance is investing. Father didn't defend me. He nodded slightly. You're too soft for this world. Business requires instinct. Too soft. It became prophecy in their mouths. When I chose library hours over galas. When I skipped a photo shoot because I didn't want my face attached to a charity we barely funded. When I asked why one longtime employee disappeared after questioning payroll discrepancies. Financially clueless, Daniel would say. Emotionally fragile, Camille would add. They mistook quiet for weakness. What they never realized. Silence is an excellent classroom. I listened through air vents when meetings ran late. Memorized terminology. Researched words they thought were beyond me. I noticed patterns. Money shifting between unfamiliar subsidiaries. Conversations that stopped when auditors were mentioned. The year I turned 16, something changed. It was past midnight. I went downstairs for water and saw light under father's office door. His voice wasn't polished. It wasn't controlled. It was sharp. You move it offshore before the quarter closes, he said. Layer it. Cayman first. Then reroute. A second voice answered nervously. Robert, this amount will raise flags. It won't, father snapped. Not if it's structured properly. I stood frozen in the hallway. Offshore. Layer it. Structure it. The words lodged in my mind like coordinates. That was the night I understood something fundamental. I wasn't excluded because I was incapable. I was excluded because I noticed too much. Back in the present, the lawyer's finger trembled slightly as he turned the page. This addendum, he said slowly, references prior offshore asset movement. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine. Camille's voice dropped. What exactly are you implying? I didn't blink. I'm not implying anything. I paused just long enough to let it settle. I'm documenting. And as the lawyer reached the final paragraph, his expression changed. Chapter 3, The Hidden Education. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Recognition. There is a secondary trust referenced here, the lawyer said slowly, eyes scanning the document again. Filed under your late mother's estate. It appears to be conditional. Daniel's jaw tightened. Conditional on what? The lawyer didn't answer immediately. And in that brief silence, my mind drifted not away from the room, but back to the years they stopped looking at me altogether. Because that's when I began building something they never saw. Daniel celebrated his 21st birthday with a watch worth more than my college tuition. Camille posted photos from Monaco, Milan, Manhattan, always angled just right, always tagged with influence. And me. I accepted a position at what father liked to call my cute little non-profit. He said it with mild amusement at dinner one night. At least she's passionate, he told a guest. It's not real finance, but it keeps her busy. I smiled politely. The non-profit's public office was small. But its parent firm wasn't. 3 floors above that modest reception desk was a compliance consulting company that audited corporate structures. I applied using my mother's maiden name. No one connected it to Whitmore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the useless daughter. I was simply competent. I learned how shell corporations are led. How funds move invisibly across borders. How tax exposure can unravel an empire in weeks. At night, I studied corporate law online. securities regulations, digital asset structures. While Camille learned which fork to use at diplomatic dinners, I learned how to read balance sheets like crime scenes. While Daniel practiced handshakes, I practiced tracing transactions. By 23, I was quietly investing in index funds, tech startups, and emerging digital assets before they surged. No flashy trades. No headlines. Just disciplined compounding. Quiet growth. The irony. Father once asked me at brunch, "Are you ever going to get a real job?" "I have one," I replied calmly. He chuckled. "That charity thing? It's sweet." Sweet. He had no idea the firm upstairs had just assigned me to review offshore movement patterns that looked hauntingly familiar. Patterns that mirrored words I'd heard years earlier through a half-closed office door. Layer it. Kaiman first. Then reroute. I didn't confront him. I documented. When Mother's trust attorney finally contacted me at 25, I met him alone. "There's a protected fund in your name," he explained. $2 million. Structured to remain untouched unless certain financial triggers are identified. "And if those triggers are identified?" I asked. He studied me carefully. "Then control shifts." Control. Not money. Power. Back in the present, the lawyer in the conference room cleared his throat. "This trust," he continued carefully, "includes activation clauses tied to documented financial misconduct within Whitmore Holdings." Daniel stood abruptly. "This is absurd." Camille's voice was tight. "There is no misconduct." I folded my hands on the table. I remembered another meeting, smaller, quieter, at a private bank downtown. The banker had reviewed the trust file, then looked at me with something close to respect. "If this trust activates," he said thoughtfully, sliding the folder back toward me, "you'll control more than you think." Back in the boardroom, Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "What exactly activates it?" The lawyer turned the final page. And then he looked directly at me. "Evidence," he said slowly, "which appears to have already been submitted." Chapter 4: The Shocking Will. The word didn't echo. It detonated. Daniel's chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. "Submitted to who?" The lawyer inhaled through his nose, composure thinning. "To federal financial authorities. The documents are time-stamped 3 weeks prior to Mr. Whitmore's passing." 3 weeks. Camille's head snapped toward me. "You went behind Father's back." I held her gaze. I went around him. Daniel's voice hardened. "This is retaliation because you didn't get enough attention." The lawyer lifted a hand. "Let me proceed." Silence fell again, heavier this time. He adjusted the original will documents, the ones everyone came to hear. As previously stated, he continued formally, "The entirety of Robert Whitmore's personal and corporate estate is to be divided equally between Daniel Whitmore and Camille Whitmore." Daniel exhaled, some of his color returning. Camille leaned back, lips curving faintly. "And to his youngest daughter," the lawyer read, "he leaves personal belongings and a written letter encouraging independence and self-discovery." A quiet murmur drifted across the room. Daniel didn't bother hiding his satisfaction this time. Camille leaned slightly toward him and whispered, not quietly enough, as expected. I felt every eye flicker toward me again, waiting for humiliation to bloom. Waiting for the useless daughter to finally understand her place. Instead, I reached down calmly and placed the leather folder on the polished conference table. The sound was soft. But it commanded the room. "There is," the lawyer continued carefully, swallowing once, "an irregularity." Daniel's smirk faltered. Camille's fingers froze mid-adjustment of her bracelet. The lawyer's voice lowered. "Because of the conditional trust filed under Mrs. Whitmore's estate, and because evidence of financial misconduct has been formally logged, the estate cannot be distributed as written." Daniel's face drained. "That's not possible." "It is," the lawyer replied. "All major accounts connected to Whitmore Holdings are now subject to temporary review." Camille's voice sharpened. "Temporary? Pending investigation." Daniel turned fully toward me now. "What exactly did you send them?" For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to lean forward. I opened the leather folder. Inside were organized copies, transaction trails, offshore incorporations, layered transfers mapped like arteries. I slid the first document across the table. Kaiman Holdings, I said evenly. Formed 12 years ago. Another document followed. Layered routing through 3 shell subsidiaries. And then another. 11.4 million redirected prior to quarterly audits. Daniel didn't touch the papers. Camille did. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the header. This is corporate restructuring, she said quickly. Perfectly legal. It wasn't disclosed, I replied. The lawyer nodded grimly. That is the issue. The room felt smaller now. Air thinner. Daniel's confidence began cracking around the edges. Even if there's an investigation, we still inherit. The lawyer hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Due to the activation clause, he said carefully, control of oversight authority shifts to the trust's beneficiary until the review concludes. Daniel blinked. What does that mean? The lawyer looked directly at me. It means, he said quietly, she does. And for the first time in their lives. They realized the will they celebrated might be the least powerful document in the room. Chapter 5. The Secret Trust Fund. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply placed my hands on the leather folder, straightening it so that it lay flat on the polished conference table. Let's make this simple, I said. Show them exactly what we're working with. The lawyer hesitated. Do you want me to project the files? I nodded. Calmly. Methodically. Yes. All of them. Every transfer, every holding, every date, every account. The room dimmed slightly as the projection screen flickered to life. A series of spreadsheets, bank records, and incorporation documents appeared in crisp detail. Now, I continued, keeping my voice soft but deliberate, this is not simply a trust created in my name. I tapped the folder. It's a safeguard my mother put in place years ago. $2 million. Fully protected. Untouchable by anyone, especially him. Daniel scoffed. 2 million? That's a drop in the bucket compared to father's estate. Exactly why you didn't see it coming, I replied. And the trust wasn't the only precaution. The lawyer glanced nervously between us. There are discrepancies within corporate filings that align with these trust protections. I allowed the room to absorb that. Years of quiet study, memorization, and observation had built up to this moment. While my siblings flaunted designer lifestyles, parties, and yachts, I quietly learned every loophole, every tax structure, every shell company that could hide or misdirect millions. I had taken internships under a different surname, studied finance and law online, traced corporate patterns, and invested silently. Father had thought I spent my days at a cute little non-profit. He didn't know. I did. And now it was time to show the consequences. Let's start with the first irregularity, I said, sliding a set of documents toward the lawyer. Notice how transfers were made just before quarterly audits. Layers upon layers, routed through accounts nobody here recognizes. The projection zoomed in on a series of transactions, dated, numbered, and annotated. Daniel's hand twitched. This is illegal. Camille leaned forward, eyes wide. Impossible. This has to be fabricated. I met their eyes evenly. Not fabricated. Documented. Filed. And confirmed by independent auditing authorities. The lawyer's finger traced down the spreadsheet. These transfers, if verified, they constitute clear evidence of misappropriation and unauthorized redirection of company funds. Daniel's mouth opened and closed. Father, my father. You trusted him blindly, I interrupted softly, while I paid attention. Then, without taking my eyes off the projection, I let the room settle in silence. The files had spoken. The evidence was irrefutable. And on the screen, the next document appeared, highlighted, unmistakable. Accounts, dates, and amounts tracing fraudulent transfers totaling millions. Daniel's hand trembled. Camille's breath caught. I leaned back slightly. "Gentlemen, ladies," I said. "Let's see what happens next." And for the first time, the entire family realized the empire they thought they inherited was no longer theirs. Cliffhanger: evidence of fraudulent transfers appears on the screen, glowing in stark red, leaving the room frozen in disbelief. Chapter 6: The Fraud Uncovered. The evidence glowed red on the projection screen, and for the first time, silence truly ruled the room. Daniel's fingers drummed nervously against the polished oak table. Camille's lips parted, but no words came out. The lawyer's eyes darted between us, hesitant, knowing the gravity of what had just been revealed. I cleared my throat. "Let's make one thing clear," I said evenly, each word precise. "This is not an exaggeration or a personal vendetta. This is fact. Documented fact." I tapped the screen. "Notice these accounts: offshore shell companies in 3 different jurisdictions. Funds were rerouted multiple times, disguised as operational expenses. The signatures here," I pointed at the scanned documents, "are not only authorized but forged in places. Forged to secure loans, shift liabilities, and inflate corporate valuations." Daniel's face went pale. You can't prove this." I smiled faintly. "Actually, I can. And I did. Months ago. Each transaction is logged with timestamps, independent audit trails, and supporting documentation. And here," I slid another folder across the table, "is the correspondence with the auditors confirming discrepancies noticed years ago." Camille's voice finally broke, trembling. You've been holding this for years." "Yes," I said softly. "And every time you celebrated, every time Father praised you, I watched. I learned. I recorded. I built. I let that settle." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Legally, until these discrepancies are fully investigated, all distributions from Whitmore Holdings are frozen. No transfers, no sales, no asset withdrawals. The inheritance you were confident in is now under review." Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for the edge of the table. "This can't happen. This is my father's company." "It is," I replied evenly. "But the company's survival depends on truth. And the truth has been hidden for years." I flipped to another document. "These emails show that you and Camille, unknowingly, signed approvals on loan agreements that moved millions offshore. Your compliance is now compromised." Camille's hand covered her mouth. I didn't know." "No," I said softly, "you didn't. But ignorance won't protect you now." The room seemed to shrink. The polished floorboards, the expensive suits, the whispering staff outside, it all faded. Only the reality of their exposure remained. Daniel swallowed hard. You can't do this. You can't just take control." I leaned back, folding my hands neatly on the folder. "I'm not taking control. I'm enforcing what the law already dictates. I'm protecting the estate from collapse, because if I don't, it's your livelihoods that vanish." The lawyer nodded, quietly reaching for the phone. "I think it's time to notify the authorities." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "You're calling them? You're bringing the government into this?" "I already did," I said calmly, letting the weight of my words settle in. "They're reviewing everything even as we speak." Camille's eyes widened, her confidence evaporating. "They're here?" "Yes," I replied. "And they're already reviewing the files." At that moment, a subtle knock echoed through the office. 2 sharply dressed men entered, badges discreetly clipped to their jackets. Daniel and Camille froze. I leaned forward, calm as ever, and smiled faintly. "Meet the auditors," I said softly. "The government investigators are already reviewing the files, and my siblings' reckless celebrations are about to collapse under legal scrutiny." Chapter 7: The Asset Freeze. "Meet the auditors," I said softly. The knock of the investigators' shoes on the marble floor was louder than any accusation my siblings had ever faced. Bank accounts were immediately suspended. Wire transfers blocked. Corporate credit lines frozen. Properties under review. Contracts paused. Investors called frantic meetings. Business partners pulled out overnight. Daniel's phone buzzed endlessly. He snatched it up. "I can't believe this." His voice cracked, high with panic. "This is insane. You can't do this. Dad would never have wanted this." I leaned back in my chair, serene. He wanted the estate protected. He wanted truth enforced. That's exactly what I'm doing. Camille appeared at my door later that evening, voice tight as she pressed herself against the frame. "Please, stop this. Just stop. You've made your point." I allowed her a long pause before speaking. "Do you remember the funeral?" I asked softly. "When you laughed, whispered, smirked. When the family mocked me while the casket was still warm?" Her eyes widened. She tried to reply, but no words came. "I didn't cry then," I continued. "I didn't argue. I didn't even flinch. But I learned. I watched. I remembered. Every snide comment. Every slight. Every useless moment. And now, I tapped the leather folder. I enforce what you willfully ignored." Daniel's calls escalated. Hysterical, demanding, threatening. "This is blackmail. You can't hold my inheritance hostage." "I'm not blackmailing you," I said calmly. "I'm enforcing the law. And protecting what's legally mine to oversee until compliance is restored." The room hummed with tension. Employees whispered in the halls. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously. Even the investigator's eyes flicked to me occasionally, respect tempered with caution. Camille's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you even know what you've done?" "I do," I said evenly. "And so will the rest of the family, very soon." I pulled the folder toward me, letting its weight settle on the table between us. The physical heft was a reminder that this wasn't speculation or rumor, it was documented, legal, undeniable. Daniel's hand hovered over the papers, shaking. You've taken control of the estate?" "Not yet," I replied, voice measured. "But I hold the keys to ensure it doesn't collapse under their recklessness." The lawyer cleared his throat, finally breaking the tension. "Miss Whitmore, technically, because of the trust's activation and the compliance review, you now hold controlling leverage over all major assets until the investigation concludes." Daniel froze. His breath caught. Camille's fingers clutched the edge of the desk. I let the words sink in slowly, deliberately. For the first time, they understood the weight of being laughed at, and the cost of underestimating me. The lawyer's declaration hangs in the air. I now control the estate, and my siblings have no choice but to follow my lead. Chapter 8: The Power Shift. The lawyer's words lingered in the room. "You now hold controlling leverage." Daniel's face drained of color. Camille's jaw tightened as if she could bite her way out of reality. I leaned back, letting the tension settle like fog over a silent city. 4 years, they had believed leadership of Whitmore Holdings was their birthright. They had strutted through boardrooms, signed contracts they didn't understand, and flaunted wealth they barely earned. And now, they were on the other side of the table. Within days, the board reached out. Senior executives I had never met called my office personally. "Miss Whitmore," one said, voice careful, "we understand the situation. We need your guidance to stabilize operations." Another added, "Your credentials, your record. It's clear you're the only one who can navigate this without triggering further scrutiny." I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Years of quiet observation, of silent strategy, of knowing the patterns of fraud and inheritance, had positioned me here. I wasn't just the beneficiary of a trust. I was the only viable legal successor capable of preventing collapse. Daniel and Camille were summoned to the same meeting. For the first time in our lives, they did not occupy the head of the table. They sat across from me, uneasy, exposed, and utterly dependent on my goodwill. Daniel's hand hovered over the tabletop, uncertain where to rest it. Camille's posture was defensive, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. The senior partner cleared his throat. "We must address governance. The auditors will be reviewing every decision made over the past 5 years." "Miss Whitmore." "Yes," I interrupted gently. "We will cooperate fully. But first, I want clarity on roles." Daniel opened his mouth. Something about entitlement, about tradition. I raised a hand. No. This isn't about entitlement. It's about accountability. I tapped the leather folder in front of me. The weight of decades of careful planning, silent investments, and recorded missteps pressed into the table like gravity. I built nothing on fantasy, I continued. Everything you assumed was secure, every transfer, every loophole, every signed approval has been documented. And I have the authority to correct it. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're not giving us a choice. I am, I said softly, eyes meeting theirs one at a time. You choose to cooperate or risk the auditors and legal authorities determining your compliance without any leniency. Camille's hands shook slightly. You're asking for, what exactly? I leaned forward, letting my calmness become pressure. I'm asking for structure, transparency, accountability, and for you to step back while the estate stabilizes. Daniel's voice rose, sharp. And what do you gain? I allowed a deliberate pause. I gain what I've been denied for years, the ability to protect what's mine, and to correct what was broken. Fair and square. The board members exchanged glances. The room was tense, each second thick with anticipation. And then I slid the leather folder slightly toward them, fingers resting lightly on top. This is my offer, I said. Their eyes flicked down to the documents, realizing that the choice was no longer theirs and that my terms would determine everything. Chapter 9, Terms of Consequence. This is my offer, I said, sliding the leather folder slightly toward them, fingers resting lightly on top. The board members' eyes flicked down at the documents, and for the first time, Daniel and Camille understood, the choice was no longer theirs. Daniel's face twisted with disbelief. You're serious? I nodded. Entirely. And let me make this clear, this isn't about vengeance. It's about accountability. Camille swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Accountability, for what? 4 decades of negligence, of false appearances, of signing off on actions you never understood, I said evenly. For participating, knowingly or not, in schemes that could have destroyed the company and the family's reputation. The room fell silent. Even the board members, seasoned executives used to cutthroat corporate meetings, shifted in their seats. I began enumerating the conditions. First, public correction of defamatory narratives. Every statement you've made about me being useless or incompetent, corrected. Transparently. Officially. In writing. To shareholders, employees, and press if necessary. Daniel's hand curled into a fist on the table. You can't force that. Yes, I can, I said calmly. Because the trust grants me legal leverage over the estate until compliance is restored. Every communication, every falsehood, every public smear will be addressed under my authority. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. And, the company. I continued. Second, legal responsibility. Every signature, every approval, every oversight previously ignored or mismanaged must be audited and assigned properly. No shortcuts. No exceptions. Any attempt to evade responsibility will leave you exposed to authorities alone. Daniel's voice rose, incredulous. You're threatening prosecution? I didn't flinch. I'm not threatening. I'm enforcing what already exists. Compliance. Law. Truth. You will either participate in restoring order, or you will face the consequences individually. The board shuffled uneasily. Some nodded subtly. They had seen too many crises to doubt the seriousness of what I was saying. And third, I said, leaning forward so my eyes caught theirs both at once, ethical restructuring of Whitmore Holdings. Every transaction reviewed. Every partnership scrutinized. No more hidden accounts. No more layered shell companies. No more shortcuts for personal gain. Daniel's fingers tapped rapidly against the folder. Camille's eyes glistened with frustration and perhaps fear. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of responsibility press down on them. The room was no longer about wealth or status. It was about survival, truth, and legality. Finally, I rested my hands on the folder and smiled faintly. You have 2 choices, cooperate fully, or face the authorities alone. The decision is yours. Daniel's voice cracked. And if we refuse? I leaned back. Then you will learn exactly why they call me the useless daughter and why I've never been that at all. For the first time, my siblings understood the full stakes. Their compliance would save them, but defiance could cost everything they had ever assumed was theirs. Chapter 10: The Final Reveal. I leaned against the polished podium, the bright flash of cameras cutting through the room like sunlight through storm clouds. The press conference hall buzzed with anticipation, reporters murmuring into microphones, cameras rolling. Whitmore Holdings had survived the turmoil. The company that everyone had assumed would crumble was standing, stable, transparent, and now under my leadership. Daniel and Camille stood at the back, awkwardly pressed together. Their perfectly tailored suits could not disguise the unease on their faces. The entitlement they once carried with pride had evaporated. They were no longer heirs. They were spectators. I adjusted the microphone and allowed a quiet pause, letting the room settle. There have been many stories circulating over the past few months, I began, calm and measured, stories about incompetence, about nepotism, about the so-called useless daughter. A few camera shutters clicked faster, the tension building. I lifted my head, letting my gaze sweep across the room. Let me be clear, I was never useless. I was simply underestimated. Murmurs rippled through the press. A reporter shouted a question about the frozen accounts, about the investigations. I addressed them one by one, careful, methodical, precise. Each answer reinforced stability. Each explanation reinforced authority. Behind me, I could see my siblings shift uncomfortably. Daniel's jaw was tight, Camille's hands clasped so tightly I thought they might leave impressions in her skin. I didn't smile at their discomfort. I simply let it exist. Months of planning, of quiet observation, of disciplined study and silent strategy had led to this moment. My mother's trust had been the foundation. My meticulous tracking of the company's patterns had been the blueprint. And now the empire that had once celebrated only my absence was thriving under my control. After the final question, I stepped away from the podium. The flashbulbs faded. The murmurs softened. The power balance in the room was clear to everyone. Later, in my office, I opened the leather folder one last time. It contained every step I had taken, every record, every calculated move. I traced a finger along the signatures, the transfers, the documents that had once been invisible to everyone else. Daniel walked past, shoulders hunched, a shadow of the man who had mocked me at my father's funeral. Camille lingered in the doorway, silent. Neither dared to speak. They had learned the hard way that underestimation can be fatal in business and in family. I closed the folder, exhaling softly. The company was safe. My position was secure. And the lessons they had ignored for years were now etched in reality. I allowed myself a private, quiet smile. They called me the useless daughter. But I was the only one who saw the collapse coming. And built the exit door in advance. Outside the office, whispers of board members hint at an unexpected new partnership, one that could expand my influence even further, beyond even my siblings' reckoning.